When we consider this changing news on tariffs and the impact it has on sentiment in this economy, looking at the consumer confidence data we got today with a massive jump after a de-escalation in tariffs and tariff rates with China specifically, what relationship do you see here between the president's trade policy and the impact it is having on everyday Americans' consumption habits?
Thanks for having me, and it's great to see you again. Look, the consumer confidence data this morning were really great. There's no other way to put it. It was the biggest jump since March of 2021, right? So very substantial improvement in consumer confidence. However, I came on your network and other networks pointing out when consumer confidence was down last time that the correlation between it and hard economic data was not as strong as it had been in the past. And I think what we're seeing is that those confidence data overreacted to the financial market activity. And now that financial markets are back, the confidence data are back too. But the bottom line is that Americans know that President Trump is a profoundly pro-business and pro-growth president. His administration is profoundly pro-growth. And just like last time, President Trump created a great economic boom through his policies. And the same thing is in the works this time. And Americans know that, and they're starting to understand that.
Well, of course, markets are jumping here on the pullback over the tariff threat in part, and wanted to hear from the president who spoke to this over the weekend on where tariff negotiations stand with the EU. Stephen, let's listen.
You spoke to European Commission President von der Leyen. Did you discuss the 50% tariff?
She just called me, as you know, and she asked for an extension on the June 1st date. And she said she wants to get down to serious negotiation. We had a very nice call, and I agreed to move it. I agreed to do that, and that she said we will rapidly get together and see if we can work something out.
President wrote on Truth Social, I have just been informed that the EU has called to quickly establish meeting dates. Stephen, when did talks begin?
Look, President Trump is one of the best negotiators in history, and throughout his long career, he's forged hundreds of deals in commercial real estate, in residential real estate, in financial markets, in legislation, and yes, in international trade as well. And what he's demonstrated yet again is that he knows how to bring the sides together to talk. And just as his tariffs brought China to the negotiating table to forge the phase one trade deal in his first term, he's managed to bring the EU to the negotiating table as well. And so I'm delighted that Commission President von der Leyen called the president. I'm delighted that they had a great call, and we really look forward to the EU starting to get serious about these negotiations. We've been very clear with the EU for weeks now that they need to be very serious about putting a real solid proposal on the table to start these negotiations, and they need to start thinking about what non-tariff barriers they can take down to open their markets to American exports.
Just to be clear, though, do we have dates on the calendar yet?
I'm not a trade negotiator, and I don't know if there are dates in the calendar, but both sides are clearly very interested in talking and very interested in reaching a deal that would head off this type of activity. And if we don't reach a deal, then the president will follow through. But, I think that it's very important that the sides get together and start talking. And to do that, the EU really needs to get serious about putting non-tariff barriers on the table.
Well, when we consider the idea that maybe the tariff rate will be brought down from 50 to something lower, the administration has made it pretty clear that no one is going to be able to get lower than the 10% base rate that is applicable to everyone. What assumptions are you making about that impact on inflation and on growth in the near term, so long as that 10% rate remains in place?
Well, so first of all, I don't want to prejudge the outcome of these negotiations. And, I think that the president, as I said before, is famous for his negotiating ability, and I can't wait to see what comes out of these trade deals. But with respect to the 10% rates, look, a 10% rate is not huge enough to have any adverse consequences in the economy. It's similar to, it's not exactly the same thing as a 10% move in exchange rate, but things like that happen all the time. And, they have an effect on the economy, and then they move on and they pass. There's not going to be any material downside consequences. We'll take in tons of revenue as a result. And by the way, that tons of revenue, hundreds of billions of dollars every year, will significantly help alleviate deficit concerns, which a lot of people are talking about.
Reporting today about the U.S. steel situation. Stephen, I know that the president is heading there later on this week. Reports that the Nippon partnership, as the president put it, is in fact a takeover. Are we comfortable calling it that?
Look, I think that they've come to a deal which is amenable to both sides, and I think the president has said in his Truth Social post that he thinks that Nippon can be responsible in boosting jobs and boosting investment, and I think that's good enough for me.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to return to the point you were just making about the deficit and concerns being raised around that, especially as Congress is working its way through this one big, beautiful bill. I know that you don't put much stock in the Congressional Budget Office analysis of the deficit impact, but you can basically look at any independent analysis and see that almost all agree this will add to the deficit. Why are they wrong and this administration right about that?
So I think that folks are wrong. And by the way, it's not that I think poorly of the CBO. I think the CBO does fabulous work in its little corner. But the problem is that the CBO follows very specific rules which have limited generalizability to the rest of the economy. It's like looking at one little corner of a painting and not the entire painting. You've got to look at the entire painting. And if we look at that entire painting, we see that the tax incentives in this bill, the improvement in deregulation by taking down red tape across the economy so that companies can build, invest, and hire when they want to instead of begging for permission from the government, reopening foreign markets to American exports. All of these are enormously growth enhancing. And if we get growth to 3%, that creates $4 trillion of additional revenue every year, over 10 years, that's not included in the CBO score. Also not included in the CBO score, tariff revenue that I just spoke of a moment ago. That's an additional roughly $3 trillion over a decade. Also not included in the CBO score, supply side policies push out the supply side of the economy through better tax incentives, through less regulation. That brings down inflation. Bringing down inflation also brings down interest rates. Interest rates were the biggest expense last year, right? Bringing that down cuts that out of the deficit. These are hundreds of billions of dollars from each of these items every year that brings down the deficit that's not included in the CBO score.
Well, as you talk about deregulation specifically, how much is the Council of Economic Advisors assuming deregulation will add to GDP growth? What does that number look like?
Yeah, so our analysis of that is that it's going to add, somewhere between 40 and 90 basis points to GDP growth. And that's potential growth. That's supply-side economic growth. And I think this is an area that economists always underappreciate. And the reason is that it's fundamentally qualitative and not quantitative. It's pretty straightforward for economists to study tax rates. It's pretty straightforward for them to study interest rates. They're numbers. You can do really good quantitative analyses. But regulations are qualitative, and it's very difficult for economists to study that, and so they underappreciate it. But the work that we've done indicates they're very, very profoundly important. I mean, think about it. If you want to open a new job site or expand into a new line of business, you may have to wait 5, 7 years begging permission from the government to do so, and that's delays to work. It increases the cost of doing business. It increases compliance costs. Those costs push through the entire system, through the entire supply chain. If you've got a 6-year delay for permits, it may mean that funding is not available also because no bank wants to lock up funding for that long. Oh, and then, by the way, at the end of the 6 years, maybe there were lawsuits, maybe there was an election, maybe you don't get your permit after all, right? And so this is incredibly powerful for holding back firms, from preventing them from investing in the economy, from doing business. And we want to get rid of those barriers so that any firm that wants to build, invest, hire can just do so.
You spoke with us last week, Mr. Chairman, about the importance of avoiding a 2011 Europe-style crisis. When you consider the debt ceiling as part of this reconciliation package, there are questions about when the X date is going to fall. I'm sure that you're asking them. How important will it be that this be handled within this reconciliation process as opposed to a separate standalone matter?
So I'm going to defer questions about the X date to my colleagues at Treasury. But, look, it's really important that we get this bill over the line, because if we don't, it's going to be the biggest tax hike in American history, in world history. It's a $4 trillion tax hike. It'll plunge the economy very likely into a very steep recession. And we don't want that, right? So it's really critical that we get this over the line and that include the debt limit.